In the 19th century, there was one European statesman that towered above all others, contrary to the expectation of both his friends and foes. Otto von Bismarck as a person managed to captivate my imagination and historical curiosity ever since my first year of university. One of his curiosities, and certainly his greatest achievement, was the unification of Germany under the King of Prussia. Now, what stands out in terms of this achievement is the near universal consensus that Bismarck was a practitioner of Realpolitik. The fact that he is so well known and such a historical anomaly due to this Realpolitik made me wonder if his practice was observable and why it was seemingly rare in history. So, well, I decided to research it. Since this is a long one, timestamps, as always, will be in the description. Before we start, in order to sketch Bismarck's character, I feel this short paragraph by Jonathan Steinberg describes him very well. In June 1862, Otto von Bismarck explained to Benjamin Disraeli, Baron Bruno, the Russian ambassador, and the Austrian envoy Wistum at the Russian ambassador's residence in London what he intended to do when he took power. 9 years later, almost to the day, the victory parade passed through Berlin. Otto von Bismarck had accomplished much more than he in 1862 had impudently promised his astonished listeners in the ambassador's parlour in London. Bismarck managed to unify Germany through several wars without upsetting the European equilibrium all too much. The Schleswig War and Bruderkrieg were two crucial wars Prussia fought and won in order to accomplish German unification, with the Franco-German War of 1870. Many biographies have been written about Bismarck, and fortunately for us, he left an incredible amount of written documents, letters, diaries, and notes. Generations after him read his memoirs in order to shape their political thought. Fact of the matter is that Bismarck is a historical anomaly and complex person. I believe this complexity makes it even more interesting to attempt to understand his politics and personality. The wars fought during the 1860s offer an insight in the strategist and politician Bismarck. Most biographers refer to him as one of the few shining examples of Realpolitik. I mean, thanks to his pursuit of Realpolitik, he managed to accomplish German unification. The amount of conflicts he embarked upon could hint at a superficial, aggressive yearning for expansion. So why wasn't Bismarck an ordinary expansionist, but a deliberate statesman and loyal advisor to his king, Wilhelm I of Prussia? It is exactly Bismarck's relationship with his colleagues, peers, and King Wilhelm I that stand central in this analysis. I'll tell you why. While Bismarck often had conflict with his adversaries, his peers, and especially the king, ought to have pursued the same objectives, don't you think? All of them wanted a more powerful Prussia. The more you'll read about Bismarck, the more you'll realize Bismarck was in constant conflict with these entities, the ones that pursued the same goals as he did. Why were these conflicts present, and what does that tell us about the possibility of Realpolitik? In order to attempt to answer these questions, I'll firstly try to conceptualize Realpolitik. What does it really mean? Secondly, what was Bismarck's personal political vision, his thoughts on the Prussian monarchy and the possibility of a unified Germany? Lastly, the Schleswig War and Bruderkrieg are elaborated upon. Not so much the chronology of the wars, but what happened behind the scenes during the wars and its aftermath. What did Bismarck's peers, colleagues, and King Wilhelm I think of the policy Bismarck was propagating? Well, that's certainly enough room for an analysis, I'd say, so let's delve into it. The term Realpolitik was thought up by the German liberal journalist August Ludwig von Rochau in 1853. Machiavelli's The Prince is often seen as one of the first documents drenched with the spirit of empiricism, describes the political tactics of Realpolitik. The word Realpolitik is used frequently, yet many political scientists and historians agree the word is poorly understood. There's a reason for this. There's barely any agreed upon explicit definition of the term. Well, there is no central definition. There are several elements that are often at the forefront of practitioners of Realpolitik. Henry Emery describes a Realpolitiker as a statesman that only lets current events and needs influence his course of action. The necessity to apply political methods that aren't always ethical, since that's often the accusation of Realpolitik, has to be understood in light of the frame of society and the geopolitical sphere. This geopolitical sphere often consists of material and structural constraints for states. Power is a crucial element. Thanks to power, policy can be carried out disregarding the aforementioned constraints. Realpolitik operates on the basis of pursuing power in a rational way, maintaining power, and applying power. As Bismarck ascended as Prime Minister of Prussia, it was the fifth greatest power on the continent, cowering between a bigger Russia, France, Britain, and Austria. There certainly were material and structural constraints when operating on the basis of Prussian interest. In order to maximize the potential of Prussia, the logical consequence would be that many Realpolitiker were seated in positions of power. I'll quote the prominent political theorist Hans Morgenthau on this. Rationality, and as such Realpolitik, tends to be the exception rather than the rule. This statement is also applicable to Prussia. Central in Realpolitik are utilitarian and pragmatic considerations. In order to apply this to Bismarck, it ought to be emphasized that Prussian conservatives developed a romantic view of transnational solidarity against liberalism and its idea of a Rechtsstaat, or state of law. The German liberals were, in their turn, preoccupied with the idea of this Rechtsstaat and how to realize it. Bismarck wasn't preoccupied with these ideals, but with the actuality. Just like Machiavelli, he realized power is the essence of politics, or in his words, Macht geht vor Recht. To deal with power in this respect, it assumes a rational thought process. This rationality detaches current events from emotions, ideologies, and to a certain degree, even morality. Friedrich Meinecke, a historian, claims that a realist has to detach himself from his emotions, personal preferences, and aversions. He ought to pursue the safeguarding of the common good. As such, a Realpolitiker has to have an objective view of the current situation. One of the many examples that underline this phenomenon in Bismarck was set by his contemporary Heinrich von Treitschke, a politician and idol among German professors. Treitschke belonged to a small group of liberals that were converted to conservatism by Bismarck. In Treitschke's words, "I think it is horrible. The most important Prussian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Bismarck, has been the most hated man of Germany." Yet, after Treitschke had met Bismarck, he recounted, "Of all moral powers in the world, Bismarck does not even hold the smallest whim." Bismarck generally did not let himself be influenced by emotions, moral considerations, or ideologies. The two components of Realpolitik applied to Bismarck's politics during the German Unification are the sober consciousness of oneself as a state on the international playing field and the capacity to envision the near and far future in order to create cost-benefit analysis and create policy that will be the most beneficial to the state. And, well, Bismarck certainly pursued those types of politics. One of Bismarck's famous sayings goes like this: "A statesman does not create the stream of time, he floats on it and tries to steer." His conviction that power was the most important asset in politics is often seen in his sayings as well. Those that stand weakest in war are most prone to give up. Those that isolate themselves lose influence, especially as the weakest of the great powers, Prussia in this case. On the 30th of September 1862, Bismarck gave his first speech to the Reichstag. In it, he said the great questions of their time would not be decided by majority decisions and debate, but sondern durch Eisen und Blut, or by iron and blood. The revolutions, nearly 15 years prior of 1848, made a great impression on Bismarck. In order to understand Bismarck as a politician, I want to look at his personal idea of objectivity, his loyalties, German nationalism, and his ultimate goal. In 1874, 3 years after the German Unification, Bismarck spoke to the Reichstag in a very telling speech. He told the Reichstag, "I am a disciplined statesman that subordinates himself fully to the needs and demands of the state, all in light for peace and prosperity of my country." There are more speeches and diary entries by Bismarck where he convinces the reader that Prussia's monarchy or his conviction the world is steered by a divine power are not up to scrutiny in his world. It's nearly altruistic, don't you think? He's convinced. He sacrifices himself for a greater good. Footnotes should be drawn, as plenty historians agree Bismarck was projecting his own ambitions and desires onto the Prussian state and God's will. It relieved him of any shame or guilt in his ruthless mission of power. He was always able to justify it to the public. He fought for the Prussian monarchy and later the German nation. That footnote isn't to say Bismarck didn't attempt to be as objective and realistic as possible, though. He often compared himself to a natural scientist. To a colleague he wrote, "I try my best to approach my official tasks with the greatest possible objectivity and correctness." He also concluded, "To achieve the greatest political gain, it ought to be pursued with the greatest possible objectivity. To the statesman, as well to the natural scientist, the only trustworthy guide is rationality." He certainly suppressed his own convictions and emotions, as in his words, "Even the king does not have the right to subordinate the interests of the country to his own personal feelings of hatred or love." So there isn't a set political strategy Bismarck pursued, more something that resembles a general political technique that Bismarck adhered to in order to maximize his gains in the dangerous game of politics. In essence, at all times, Bismarck held multiple irons in the fire. He ensured political flexibility, the option to always choose a different path if it suited him better. A contemporary from Bavaria managed to put it into words. In major domestic and foreign affairs and questions, Prince Bismarck likes to provide himself with an alternative, in order to be able to decide the same in one of two opposed directions. Bismarck was continuously aware of the changing circumstances around him and managed to display great flexibility in adjusting to these situations. So it took a while, but we have arrived at the wars that Bismarck became famous for. In 1864, the Danish King Frederick VII, against protocols of London, attempted to push a new constitution to the domains of Schleswig and Holstein. Considering the majority of the population was German, a nationalist reaction from mainly the smaller German states erupted. The suppressed Germans within these two domains had the right to self-determination after all. The Protocols of London said they could. Bismarck approached this event with the intention to annex both duchies. While annexing them didn't have the absolute priority, it was the best result that could come from the dispute. Now, here's where we get to the first glimpse of Bismarck's Realpolitik. Characteristic for this event was the resistance from noble convictions that Bismarck experienced among his colleagues and peers after he told them of his proposed approach, so not even his adversaries. During a meeting with the crown, Wilhelm I lifted up his arms as if he was doubting my sanity, Bismarck later reminisced. Prussia did not have a rightful claim over these duchies, which was made very clear to Bismarck by Wilhelm. The king stuck to his romantic ideal of conservative solidarity and sovereignty of the government of both duchies. Bismarck's proposals were controversial to the degree that Wilhelm ordered to have them erased from the minutes of the meeting. After all, Bismarck certainly wouldn't want to have the world know about his preposterous ideas. The contrary turned out to be true. Bismarck personally made sure his utterings were replaced. With great skill and dexterity, Bismarck manipulated the situation. Eventually, the Crown Council agreed to a war. Bismarck saw this diplomatic campaign as his magnum opus. Regardless of the complex relation with the Austrian Empire, he managed to goad them into an alliance so both great powers could wage war on the much smaller Denmark. The Schleswig War was a fact. It didn't take too much effort for Prussia and Austria to crush Denmark. Following their victory, Bismarck managed to place the duchies under both Austrian Habsburg and Prussian Hohenzollern control. Prussia received Schleswig and Austria received Holstein, a duchy that was far removed from its territory, isolated by Prussian territory. Friction between Austria and Prussia over these duchies allowed Bismarck with a new trump card. A situation could be created where Austrian interference in small German kingdoms, and certainly Prussia, could forever be removed. Bismarck was one of the few men that wanted to exploit this opening. His colleagues weren't supportive of his plan. Bismarck started pressuring his colleagues in the Crown Council and Wilhelm himself to annex both duchies, as this would ensure the definitive consolidation of Prussian territory. It would lead to an inevitable war with Austria. Bismarck's primary goal was to push Austria back, as it had interfered with political issues among the German states for centuries by establishing a Northern German Bund. Creating this Bund or confederation meant dethroning or at least curtailing the power of many German princes and kings. As for the Catholic southern German states, they weren't too eager to join in Germany, united under Prussia. As you can imagine, there was fierce resistance against Bismarck's plans, even from his colleagues and the king himself. King Wilhelm was extremely fierce in his resistance. There is no talk yet of war, let alone of dethroning German princes. Bismarck tactfully used diplomacy, or rather lack thereof, to bait Austria into a war. Eventually, two mistakes by the Austrian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Count Alexander von Mensdorf, led to the direct reason for Wilhelm to declare war on the Austrian Empire. The Crown Prince of Prussia opposed the war as well, considering it fratricide, hence the name Bruderkrieg for the war, that in my opinion perfectly shows Bismarck's cunning, political genius and Realpolitik approach. So, when 2 years after the Schleswig War, the Bruderkrieg between Austria and Germany erupted, Bismarck wrote to the commander of Prussian forces, General Helmut von Moltke. The goal is to have Austria agree with the new German constitution we want to install. Containing ourselves to northern Germany allows for understanding from southern German states, mainly Bavaria as well. Austria didn't adhere to the Gastein Convention that had been agreed upon in the wake of the Schleswig War. It allowed Holstein's Diet to convene. Finally, King Wilhelm was convinced of the necessity of war. Austria didn't adhere to its agreements. In his words, treachery by Austria is followed with lies, and lies are followed with the violation of good faith. So had Bismarck steered towards a war with Austria from the moment the Schleswig War was over. After all, he wanted to push Austria out of Prussian and German affairs. Well, he had undoubtedly realized the potential of a war with Austria, yet early in his career Bismarck was in favor of an agreement with Austria, where Germany would be divided by the Main River, a North and South Germany, if you will. Bismarck considered this possibility far after the tensions between Prussia and Austria reached a near boiling point. Even in May 1866, as the war with Austria seemed inevitable, Bismarck repeated his offer to Ludwig von Gablenz, an Austrian general. Until the very last moment when the troops finally clashed in battle, Bismarck retained his trump card in the event of King Wilhelm not willing to wage war, or if French intervention would make war with Austria too risky. Yet again, Bismarck had multiple irons in the fire. The chronology and events of the Bruderkrieg is fascinating. I mean, Austria got crushed within 7 weeks, and it featured the Battle of Königgrätz that certainly speaks to the imagination. But the fascinating aspect for this analysis is what happened behind the scenes in its aftermath. After Prussia had, unexpectedly might I add, defeated the Austrian Empire, the only question that remained was how far will it go to demand concessions from Austria? In Berlin there was speculation about the absolute necessity of annexing Saxony and Bavaria to southern German states, let alone other alluring annexations. Some politicians even wanted to push through to Vienna and perhaps Hungary. Prussia had won, after all, and should exploit its victory. A basic assumption about Realpolitik would assume that the logical result of such a landslide victory would mean to exploit it to its greatest extent. And here's where Bismarck truly shines. He did exactly the opposite. He used strategic restraint, and mind you, literally no one at the Prussian court was happy with what he did. Lothar Gall describes Bismarck's actions as retreating at the moment of victory. Previously I mentioned how part of Realpolitik is an awareness of oneself on the international playing field and the ability to foresee both the short and long-term future. Bismarck was very well aware of all elements and how his actions would be perceived by other countries. If King Wilhelm and the Prussian military command got what they wanted, the Prussian army would end up taking Vienna or even enter Hungary. Such a frontal assault would certainly disturb Europe's equilibrium and would have resulted in hostile climates in Paris, Moscow and London, if not immediately, a foreign intervention. Bismarck was aware of this, and thus, whilst aggressively pursuing the war, he now had Austria where he wanted them, and showed restraint. King Wilhelm, the Prussian military high command, and Prussian ambassadors had other plans, however. Ambassadors in Paris and München complained about the fact that Bismarck did not want to consolidate the unification of Germany. Whilst some argue about military inferiority, it becomes pretty evident when reading about this that the Prussian High Command was fully convinced of their military superiority. Paul Kennedy nuances this by stating that several mistakes were made, yet the Prussian victory was an incredible morale boost for the Prussian army. Many of Bismarck's colleagues were led by their emotions. A swift victory led to impulsive, short-sighted and dangerous ambitions. Jonathan Steinberg describes Bismarck's worries during this time. He felt as if he was playing cards with £1,000,000 franc. That wasn't really his money. Bismarck's card game had played out great so far. Now it was his mission to ensure Prussia wouldn't outplay itself. So Bismarck didn't follow the king and military high command in their wish for concessions. But why? As a vassal of the Prussian king and monarchist, if any, wasn't his priority the expansion of Prussia? Bismarck realized Austria should become an ally instead of an enemy. If Prussia alienated Austria, it could enter an alliance with the much-hated France, or even more hated Russia, a former partner Austria had horribly betrayed during the Crimean War. In his memoirs written in 1890, Bismarck reflects on the situation. I attempted to make clear one cannot lethally wound someone when he has to live with them in the future. King Wilhelm responded, "My first minister, Bismarck, is a deserter in the eyes of the enemy, and he forces me to this humiliating peace." This exchange of words between Wilhelm and Bismarck were the most serious during their relationship. Eventually, after Bismarck threatened to resign as Prussia's prime minister and the subsequent intervention of the crown prince, King Wilhelm accepted the peace Bismarck proposed. The southern German states of Bavaria, Baden and Württemberg remained independent, but had to sign a treaty of alliance. When the representative of Bavaria was told of these very mild demands, it is said he burst into tears and hugged Bismarck. Peace with Austria was established without annexations and without a victory parade. According to Steinberg, this was Bismarck's pinnacle in human and diplomacy terms. In a letter Bismarck wrote to his wife 6 days after the victory, he wrote, "I have the thankless task of reminding people we're not on our own in Europe, but with 3 other great powers that hate us and are jealous of us." In his memoirs, he reminisces, "I had the greatest possible difficulty with getting the king into Bohemia and the greatest possible difficulty getting him out again." This sentence certainly describes this precarious situation, and it makes it all the more commendable. He was able to and foresaw Austria was a crucial ally in the war that would follow with France 4 years later. The aftermath of the Bruderkrieg highlights Bismarck's Realpolitik sentiment. Previously, people could have argued Bismarck was an expansionist, which is why he was fighting with his colleagues. All doubt is now removed. His cost-benefit analysis was on another level than most of his colleagues. The irony is the fact that he pursued an aggressive policy in attempting to get Prussia into this war, and once it was won, to restrain it. The battle for German reign was nearly finished. The question now posed itself: who was superior in Western Europe? Was it Prussia or an increasingly nervous and suspicious France? Nearing the end of the 1860s, both countries were weighing their chances. France seemed the strongest. Its population was larger and the French army had the best rival available at the moment, the chassepot and the mitrailleuse. Its navy outmatched Prussia by a lot. Not just that, but it was very likely Austro-Hungary, as it was now called, and Italy would come to France's aid if war were to break out. When in July 1870 the conflict reaches boiling point and war seemed inevitable, few French doubted the outcome of the war. The swift victory of Prussia ended this fantasy. On the 4th of September, the French army surrendered at Sedan and Napoleon III became a prisoner of war. In Paris, the imperial army was overthrown. Prussia had now truly established itself as a European great power. Europe had lost a mistress and gained a master, in Kennedy's words. The consequence of this war was, among other things, the unification of Germany in the Kleindeutsche Staat and annexation of Alsace-Lorraine. Bismarck pushed Prussian King Wilhelm to be crowned in the Hall of Mirrors of Versailles as the Kaiser of the new German Reich. The annexation and coronation of Wilhelm were the reason for French revanchism, which would be one of the reasons for the First World War. Realpolitik and Bismarck's neutral and objective vision seems to be completely absent. There's a reason why many historians refer to Bismarck's decisions over here as the single greatest mistake of this lengthy political career. I don't think they're too wrong. Nevertheless, in the words of Hans Morgenthau, rationality is the exception rather than the rule, perhaps even for Bismarck. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you found it interesting. This was based on a paper I wrote in university. It was extremely interesting to research this topic again, and Prussian and German history, it provides such a fruitful ground for fascinating political analysis and historical research that it's something you'll see much more of on this channel. Thank you very much for watching once again, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.